righty, good afternoon, everyone. It is truly a pleasure to be here this afternoon to moderate the Hack Attack and Recovery panel. My name is Joanna Fields, and I'm the principal founder of Aplomb Strategies. For the past 2 years, Aplomb has been focused on cybersecurity risk in regulation, the trends in regulation, to help our clients, which are mainly trading entities, registered investment advisors, and financial technology vendors, get ahead of the regulation that's coming down the pipe with regards to cybersecurity. Today, it's clearly a focus of the regulators, and we're expecting that will remain a focus of the regulators for years to come. Following the SEC's recent cybersecurity sweep, the report that they issued noted several interesting factors for the trading community. Since we're talking about the cybersecurity investment, I figured we'd focus on the actual pipes and plumbing of the trading system with regards to regulation. 60% of registered investment advisors don't actually have compliance to ensure that their policies and procedures are kept up to date with regards to cybersecurity. A third, or actually less than a third, of registered investment advisors don't do any risk assessment with regards to cybersecurity of their technology vendors for routing their orders to the market. So it should actually come as no surprise to everybody in this room that the first enforcement action that the SEC took in the last year was against a registered investment advisory firm for failing to have the best practice controls and procedures in place. As a former regulator, I am well aware that the SEC and FINRA seldom state that there will be a cybersecurity priority for this year without having a bevy of investigations already in the pipeline. The US regulators, notably the SEC, has already emphatically stated that they are going to go after registered entities that do not publicly disclose that they have experienced a breach, and for civil and or criminal enforcement actions. Cybersecurity breach is something that no one on my panel today takes lightly. The aim of the group, and I will let them introduce themselves momentarily, is to talk about how you identify a risk, how you assess damage and vulnerability, and how you actually take the next steps to remediate any breaches that you've experienced. More importantly, the panel is going to share with you today missteps that companies have actually taken, lessons learned, for example, that we can go ahead and take the next step forward to ensure that if you do experience a breach, what you do next. Moreover, if we have enough time, I'll let them get to it in a second. We're going to focus on regulatory focus globally, training, the importance of training, and of course, messaging, how you internally and externally communicate you have a breach to regulators, the media, your clients. So Mike, if you would please kick us off by introducing yourself briefly, and then we'll get into the questions.
Sure, my name is Mike Morris. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Route 9B. A little background about myself so you guys know where I come from when I'm sharing some of these answers. Prior National Security Agency cyber operator, one of the Air Force's first cyber operations folks. I was the 6th overall entity to stand up the 315th Network Warfare Squadron. I went on to write the Air Force's schoolhouse for cyber operations, and then ultimately their individual training programs, and then went on to write NSA's cyber operations component. So significant background in analysis, operations, and training. So as I go through some of these stories, I've been there, done that. A little background on Route 9B, if you're not familiar with who we are. Cybersecurity firm focused on hunt operations. We basically we have the highest contingent of former certified operators coming out of US Cyber Command, CIA, NSA, et cetera, because that's where cyber operations really have started in the US government and now are making their way into the commercial sector. And so we've been able to amass a very large amount of talent under the roof, everything from operators to developers to analysts. So we have capabilities where we can go through, leverage, be able to hunt, and then take out an adversary inside of a client's infrastructure, whether that be financial, retail, or US government type entities.
John?
I'm John Shegerian, the co-founder and CEO of Electronic Recyclers International. We're the world's largest hardware information destruction company, and we basically go the last mile. We handle, everyone's been talking today about protocols and software. We handle all the hardware for governments, large corporations, small corporations, and everybody in between.
No applause?
I think he is definitely applause worthy, definitely.
right.
And my name, thank you, Joanna, is Ben Smith. I am the field CTO for RSA's East Coast lines of business. RSA, if you're not familiar with us, have been around for about 30 years, believe it or not. Most of our legacy history is in the encryption space. In the last 2 decades, we've been probably a little more popular around the key fobs that you and I might carry around with the numbers that flip over every 60 seconds. We've actually reorganized just in the last 5 years around several of the problems that I think we're going to be talking about today that have really reoriented us as an organization around new areas of solutions, including governance, risk, and compliance, what we call advanced security operations, and a identity portfolio. So that's the quick 30 seconds on me, Joanna.
Thank you, everybody. All right, let's get to the heart of the matter, because we're, oh, excellent. I'm sorry.
Thank you for the applause from the cheap seats. I appreciate it.
We knew this panel was going to be fun, or try to make fun of a hack attack discussion. All right, so the heart of the matter. Let's talk about the financial markets. It represents a good example because it's a real Gordian knot of complex technologies. So Mike, what are the key steps in a complex technology trading platform that you would recommend that a firm use to identify and uncover that the hack has actually taken place?
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, right now, if we looked at the cyber landscape and the way organizations posture themselves, what's been happening is everyone's been buying automated solutions, right? We've been going out buying software products, buying perimeter device capabilities, and whether it's in a financial market, retail, whatever have you, they basically try to keep the adversary from getting inside the network, right? However, what we see with Target, Home Depot, JP Morgan, OPM, the list goes on and on. In every case, once the adversary got inside of that environment, they were able to maneuver freely and uncontested. There was no one sitting there looking for them. If I use the analogy, or I guess kind of a similarity in the physical security space, when we come into the facility here, and I'll actually use my environment coming in today, when I walked into here, I had to go through a security check to go and make sure my access was good. I couldn't drive down the street. I had to walk out in the rain, right? Because they have barriers so you can't get close to the facility. As I end up coming in, there's additional folks checking my access. There's camera systems on the elevators and all around me. In that environment, there are all these technologies. The camera system is a technology. The barriers are technology. The only variable in that security element was the physical security guard with the weapon that was standing at the beginning and the folks that were walking around inside the hallways. And so when we take a look at cybersecurity, the way that we've postured ourselves is we basically put the technologies on the outside of the network, but soon as someone brings a 13-foot ladder and climbs over the 12-foot fence, they're able to get in and run freely. And so for organizations really to be able to start to secure themselves better, it's not buying a new automated solution or going to RSA and trying to pick from your thousands of endpoint products that are out there. Instead, what needs to happen is pick your solution, whatever that capability is, and then start focusing on empowering your people to start looking for the adversary that is bypassing those security products. In the case of Route 9B internal, not to turn this into a sales pitch, what we do is essentially we go through and we do hunt operations, the proactive defense, leveraging all of those security products that you already had, but still looking across the different endpoints and the networking devices to identify if there is a breach or someone bypassing those automated solutions, and then from there, being able to go and leverage it.
Ben, do you have any thoughts on vulnerability assessment?
Yes, I do, fortunately for all of us. Briefly, I think I would certainly agree with everything that you've just heard from Mike. I can tell you from RSA's perspective, over the last 5 years especially, and from an industry perspective, probably longer, if there's one key shift that all of the vendors, whether they're software or hardware, really have experienced, it's around this legacy prevention model. Everybody has maybe firewalls protecting the bad guys from getting into your organization. You might have antivirus that's running to protect the endpoints inside your organization. Those are still important technologies, but part of what we would characterize as a defense in depth capability. But I'm still having, disappointingly, even today in 2016, too many conversations with customers who are still kind of stuck in that prevention model. If I just build a big enough moat around my organization, I should be protected, right? Well, as you just heard Mike kind of talk through in terms of what he's seen and what his company is doing as a business model, when the bad guys get in, and it is when the bad guys, not if the bad guys get into your environment, what we are starting to see at RSA, and I think many other vendors would agree, is while prevention, it continues to be important, detection is the one thing that we're trying to get more and more organizations to understand. If you can't detect when the bad guys, the bad organizations, the bad nation states are inside your environment, you're not going to be able to see that the data is being moved from point A to point B. Having that visibility inside your own environment is something that a lot of organizations are just now waking up to understanding, do I really understand what's happening in my environment? So again, I would kind of net that out. Prevention is important, but let's not forget about the essential importance, the escalating importance around detection. Two different things. In a perfect world, there's budget for both of those buckets. But again, too many of the customers I'm talking to even today are still almost exclusively focused in the prevention space. Detection is very important. Joanna.
And may I add something? I'd actually add a third phase on that too. So you have your prevention phase, which is, to your point, what everyone's doing. They have to start focusing on detection. But even organizations, in the case of a JP Morgan or one of these large organizations, they, in many cases, they have the capabilities to detect it.
Yep.
There needs to be a third phase, and that's where there's a response,
Yep.
right? And so when you detect it, you need to be able to quickly get in there, mitigate, and identify what's taken place. To Ben's point, right now, I think the average, depending what organization you look at, is over 200 days that an adversary maneuvers inside of a network before they're detected. And then at that point, it's about 6 months to a year and a half of remediation to go and remove the adversary. If you gave me 200 days inside of any network, I'm going to wreak havoc, right? I was trained to do that. That's what's happening, whether it's a nation state or an organization like Anonymous or whoever. Once they get in, they're able to maneuver. So the responses that have to come from the community in cybersecurity is not only prevent, detect, but they need a response action that comes in on the back end.
All right, so John gets a chance to speak. I know nobody's going to talk about regulation with regards to penetration and vulnerability. At least we've got those covered. But John, you have a unique perspective in that the disposal of information, I know when I talk to clients about AML and the importance of privacy, or if you go out to Korea or Russia or any of the other foreign countries, privacy protection is important, but the disposal of hardware, taking down or winding down legacy systems, what should people be thinking about then?
Well, let me just start by saying this, and thank you, Joanna. How many people in this room right now today are holding on to their old cell phones, hard drives, or any other electronic devices in their home or office because they just don't know where to get rid of them safely? Just raise that. Okay, I'll meet with you after this conference in the back. And I'm sure some of you weren't raising your hands. The bottom line is, if your companies like Sony and Target and the hundreds of other examples that have been made on the cover of the newspaper, you lose your career if you get rid of your hardware inappropriately, potentially. So the information contained in all of the hard assets that companies across the United States and the world are using right now is as dangerous as a ransomware attack and any other malware attack. So we had this wonderful conference today we're all attending, and I hear everything about protocol. I'm meeting all these wonderful software companies and other great investors. Nobody's been talking about where does the hardware go. Mike Steed, in one of the last conferences, who was sitting up here on the right-hand side, said the US federal government has about $17 billion worth of hard assets, the federal government, that they're looking to get rid of appropriately. That's just the US federal government. Besides CEOs worrying about their career, board members worrying about the reputation and goodwill of a company that they sit on the boards of, and the data that's encrypted or involved with all this hardware has to be handled the right way. We're the only company in the world, and right now in every zip code in the United States, that will turn your hardware, turn your data into dust. This is what it looks like when we're done with it. This is one size, this is another based upon the service fees that we charge. And although the software is critical part of the element, we're the last mile. What we do is the last mile. Hardware is just important as the software, because if you don't take care of the hardware side of your assets in your business, you're leaving the back door open for a horrible breach or cybersecurity attack.
All right, since we're going to go back and talk about an actual hack attack, surprisingly or not, you watch a movie, in the real world, there isn't a cinematic moment where an alarm bell blares and the CTO gets a very concise email stating exactly what happened, what went wrong, and the remediation steps. So keeping that in mind, that more often than not, it's going through a pattern of activity looking for a breach that actually needs to happen to maybe identify a potential threat. Ben, can you walk us through what should happen next? So you're fortunate enough to find you've actually been breached, and you found it really quickly. What do you do next?
Well, in a perfect world, Joanna, where you can jump back into your time machine, hopefully the most important essential, sometimes it literally is a piece of paper that you need to have before you get that email with that summary, is kind of the third leg that Mike talked about, and that's the response leg. Having some sort of an incident response plan, something that you have thought about, something that you have documented, something that you have battle tested, taken it out for a run to make sure that Group A, Group B, and Group C know how to communicate with each other in the middle of a crisis. I've had consultations with some customers. RSA and many other vendors have incident response services that are available for customers whose hair is on fire in the middle of a breach. But we strongly prefer also to work with folks who are not yet at that point, but they're planning. So this is my very long-winded approach, Joanna, to get around to answering your question. Having an incident response plan, and maybe we can talk a little bit more in the time we've got here, that's not just a technical response plan. I think I heard in at least one of the earlier sessions here today that has to encompass your legal team. It has to encompass, maybe even more importantly, your marketing team. The PR messaging that has to go out both externally to your customers, maybe to the government or the governments that might be affected, certainly to your employees. So have an IR, an incident response plan. Make sure it's not just a technical plan, and with luck we'll be able to talk a little bit more about that. I don't want to steal too much more time.
All right, so Mike, the communication of a breach, does the size of a company matter? Who actually needs to know?
Yeah, so the size doesn't really matter. It comes down to the sophistication of their security program and their incident response, as Ben was talking about. What we found in our dealings with customers is many organizations, and playing off of Ben's comments, many organizations aren't prepared. So when there ends up being a breach and we end up getting a phone call, it's often hair on fire mode, and we have to be kind of the calming in the storm for them, walking them through whether it's a technical approach on how to go and identify it. Now, depending on the level of the breach, obviously the leadership needs to know, but you could end up running into having to pass that over to legal team and other organizations to be able to get that out and potentially pull in law enforcement, et cetera.
All right, for the panel, if there is a third-party vendor involved who actually experiences the breach, what do companies need to do next? Who needs to be notified within the company? And do you find most companies are prepared for third-party issues?
I can safely say, it's been my experience, most customers are really struggling, Joanna, with that particular question. It's hard enough for us, even in a smaller organization, to kind of get our arms around what the risks and the threats might be to my company. And then once you start looking at the third-party risk, that's going to be multiplied a number of different ways. So being able to at least understand, and this is going to sound silly, guys, but it is as simple as asking the question, do I have a list of all of my third-party vendors? Mm-hmm. That's really kind of a good place to start, because that very simple question sometimes doesn't have a straight answer. And even for those customers who have the right answer, which is yes, I have that list, my follow-up question is, and when did you last validate that list? And frequently it's a, hey, we created this list 12 months ago and we were comfortable with it at that point. The odds are your business has probably changed over the last 12 months. More to the point, for everybody who's up on the panel, the nature of the threats that are presenting themselves to organizations have also changed over the last 12 months. So again, I don't want to be too academic, but just asking that simple question, do I know who all of my third-party vendors are, then allows you to start having the conversation about how do I understand the contracts that I have in place. Specifically to Joanna's point, if one of those third-party vendors is breached, do I have any sort of contract agreement that is going to commit them, maybe within the context of a service level agreement? Are they obligated to notify me as one of their partners within a certain amount of time? Do I have somebody on my team who's tracking that service level agreement or that SLA? Even if you have a small number of third-party partners, that can be a lot of work. Trying to automate that, just trying to identify that is often essential to success.
I ask this because I used to work for a large broker-dealer trading entity that had over 500 different platforms. And if you went front to back on the chain, and managing those vendor relationships was always fun, just from the trading side, much less the cybersecurity. All right, so John, what are the successful ways you've seen to actually mitigate data loss? But probably more importantly, what strategies have failed?
What strategies have failed? Strategies that have failed on the hardware side are companies or government entities believing what they read on the internet about their hardware and where their hard assets are going. As was pointed out on an earlier panel, first you have to identify what all your assets are, which ones are at risk. But then more importantly, to Ben's point, you have to understand who you're now going to send your hardware out to. And that's just, you can't pick that person based on price, and you can't pick that entity based on what you read on the internet. You have to audit that company yourself and make sure that the audit's being done to some certifying body, plus to your own satisfaction and your own standards. And when you do that, you have the greatest chance of mitigating or preventing totally the data loss that's contained in all hardware assets.
Mike, do you have something to add?
Yeah, sure. So on the intellectual property side, I guess, or just data as a whole, I think the biggest problem that I see in organizations that have data loss is they don't know where their data was to begin with. They also don't know who had access to that data. So I think some of the easy ways to be able to go through and mitigate it is, one, know where your data is residing. If it's intellectual property, have it in only areas where it needs to be. And then control the access to the people that are going to be able to go through and be able to interact with that, so that you don't have it in a million different places and trying to chase it around.
And if I can just add on to that point, Mike, one of the first products that I learned to talk about when I joined RSA 6.5 years ago was a data loss prevention, or a DLP tool, which is no longer in our portfolio. And the big surprise for me, as somebody coming at it from the vendor side, was we had more customers using that DLP solution for exactly the scenario that Mike laid out. I don't know where my sensitive data is. I need to secure it. I want to make sure I catch it before it leaves, but I'm going to use this DLP, whether it was RSA's or someone else's platform, to find the sensitive data in my environment. Really speaks to the challenge, whether it's unstructured file formats that might be living on file shares, Excel spreadsheets, Microsoft Word documents, et cetera, or whether it's other types of information. Even in a smaller organization, I think a lot of us are challenged to know the answer to that question.
Thank you. All right, so since this is a cyber investing summit, I figured we should also bring out the words like blockchain and Bitcoin. So I came up with just a question on this topic. A little bit taboo, but Mike, in our realm, talking about cybersecurity and a potential hack, if somebody actually does experience a breach, my understanding is that oftentimes there's some sort of ransomware which requires a Bitcoin payout. Is there any advice you might be able to give the audience as to what to do if you experience a hack and then receive a ransomware request?
Yeah, so it depends, right? So you have ransomware, which is running relatively rampant now. Everyone's probably heard about it or seen the FBI bulletins. For those of you that haven't, essentially what's happening is attackers are taking advantage of organizations. They have a self-replicating worm in most cases where it'll steal some form of credentials, exploit multiple machines inside the network, and then start encrypting the files on those devices. And then the only way you can get those encrypted files back is by paying them through Bitcoin, right, is ultimately how they're doing it. And so what they're forcing you to do is go in, pay some exuberant amount inside of Bitcoin, and then they claim to know who you are. They give you the key back so that you can decrypt your files. There's also, though, to play off of that, there's other organizations, such as Armada Collective and a few others out there now, that are posing to be anonymous, and the Lizard Group, et cetera, where what they're doing is they're sending emails into organizations, and then they're telling them that they need to go through and ultimately just pay the Bitcoin, or else they're going to launch a dedicated denial of service attack. So it's become a means for extortion, to be able to go through, pull out cash. So the reason I bring up both of those is because they're two different scenarios. In the case of ransomware, you have to be able to respond quickly. Back to the discussion we talked about earlier, you need to know what your response is going to be. So if it gets inside your network, you can quickly shut it off and stop it from replicating throughout the entire environment and taking down your critical data. In the case of the email that I was talking about, where they're basically using it in a forms of extortion, in that case, I believe it was the FBI and others have come out and publicly said, don't pay it, because it's not a credible threat, right? And so depending on what organization you're dealing with or how they got in there is going to change the way that you should end up responding.
Thank you.
And if I may, Joanna, let me just add on to that excellent commentary, Mike, and that is the whole concept of ransomware, believe it or not, guys, has been around for almost 25 years. I think the earliest documented example that I've read about occurred in the late 1980s. And whether it's ransomware, as Mike has described, where they've come in the front door of the computer and they've selectively start to encrypt specific files or directories on that computer. There's another related attack called lockerware, where maybe you've heard or seen this as well, where you sit down just in front of your computer and you have absolutely no access to the computer. They've kind of put up a roadblock right there at the front door. None of the files behind that screen have been encrypted, but if you can't get to the files, the net effect is the same. So we've seen a lot of this over the last 20 to 25 years. My concern in the paranoid part of my brain, which lives back here, is we're starting to see this activity more and more with Windows and in some cases Macintosh-based laptops or desktops. You know, we've also got all these other computers that we carry around with us. And while I am not yet read in or fully understand if there have been any truly widespread attacks that include encryption against these devices, that lockerware variant, where it's just putting up a screen to keep me from the data on my cell phone, I think we're going to start to see more of that as we move into 2016 and 2017. So the broader point I guess I'm making to the panel as a whole and to the audience is the technology has been out there a long time. Going back to what I talked about before in terms of having an incident response plan, I would argue a good incident response plan will have as one of its scenarios what happens if and when we find ransomware on the network. Maybe even that document, whether it's electronic or physical, maybe you've already done a cost-benefit analysis. You might be able to know immediately if the amount of information that has been encrypted exceeds this dollar amount and the ransom demand is below this dollar amount, maybe the decision should be pay it or not, depending upon the nature of the attack. So doing your homework, preferably, this is the time machine that I talked about before. If you've got that information available while your hair is on fire, because every customer, their hair is on fire, when something like this happens, having that information documented helps it go a little more smoothly and a little more rationally.
On that positive note, so you've been fortunate enough to identify that you actually have experienced a hack, and you've identified the data that you've lost and find ways to remediate it. Now, how do you actually go to the next step? Practical terms, not just this legalese and documentation. What are the next steps to secure the business, Mike?
So you identify the breach. From there, ultimately, well, it goes back to kind of what we've been talking about the entire time is really those three steps, right? It should be a never-ending cycle. So you identify the breach, you should be able to go through, respond to that specific breach that took place, hurry up, try to remediate it, get it out of your network, and then ultimately readapt your security posture to now be able to stop that breach from coming back. right? And so your adversary, I guess if I was to paint this lightly, your adversary, when they're coming at your network, they're adapting to your security environment and tailoring their exploitation mechanisms to blend in so that they can live inside the environment. From a security model, we need to adapt to the adversary. Every adversary works with a specific methodology. We're creatures of habit. You need to kind of focus on what is that human doing behind the attack, understand that so that you can go and keep that adversary from coming back in or attempting to gain execution inside your environment.
All right, John, you've determined that you need to secure the data, obviously. Are there any steps that you would take with regards to what would you do if you had a compromised system? Would you destroy the data? Would you try to look at the data? Would you analyze it? What would you do with systems and hardware for an analysis perspective?
Yeah, from the hardware side, it's always destroy. And we destroy. But from a service side and a protocol side, we're always looking to help the client or vendor understand where things went wrong and how to better practice in the future. So many clients have come to us over the years because they had protocol breaches and breaches in data before, and they wanted to get better in the hardware side of what they're doing. That's an ongoing process, and we work with clients out there and potential clients to constantly study downstream vendors, constantly study their protocol and how to get better at protecting their data from the hardware perspective. But we are always in the destruction mode when it comes to all hardware and information.
Yeah, and in fact, to John's point, several companies, large and small, especially many of us in the information security space, may actually have corporate policies so that if I traveled to a specific foreign country, and if my laptop or maybe my phone was out of my constructive control for some amount of time, in some cases, I'm not allowed to plug that device back into my corporate network, period. I might need to call on John for his services to physically destroy that device. That may or may not be the right answer, right, for your organization. To Joanna's larger point in terms of what do you do with that compromised system, kind of the decision point that a lot of the customers that I've spoken with have to decide is after they have isolated the breach. When I say a breach, as you've heard Mike and John and I all kind of use that phrase, that could be one machine that is infected. It could be a lot of machines or servers inside your environment that are affected. Once you've kind of got your arms around and you've actually contained it, then what do you do? Is it a matter of I've identified that all of these machines are connecting outside my network to some machine out on the internet and I've shut off access to that external machine? Have I contained the attack at this point? Maybe so, maybe not. However you get there, and there are many companies and solution providers that can help you get to that answer in the incident response space, where I find a lot of customers struggling is once I've gotten to that point, do I just throw away or destroy, or do I re-image that machine, or do I spend some additional time trying to dissect what's actually occurred in the environment? I've put out the fire. Do I really know how the fire started in the first place? More mature organizations, maybe folks with a named chief information security officer or some sort of an information security function, they might have the luxury in terms of having one or more people who can devote some cycles to answering that second question, dissecting actually what happened. A lot of organizations don't have that luxury. So a lot of folks will wind up simply, to John's point, either destroying that or just rewiping it. They think it's a software-only issue, so they wipe the machine and they send it back out again, which may or may not be the right thing to do, depending upon the nature of the attack. So there's no easy answer, I think, for many of the three of us up here today. But I can tell you that that's a very common pain point for a lot of my customers, deciding when can I put this attack down so that I can go work on the other 49 things that are on my plate right now.
And to that point, Ben, that you brought up a great point that I wanted to elaborate on. One thing that I think the community as a whole can learn is, I call it whack-a-mole. What I've seen in terms of breaches is most organizations, and I say most, they just go re-image the machine, put it back on the network, and then the very next week the attacker comes in and does the same thing he did before, right? I mean, it's a never-ending cycle. Really what needs to change obviously I talked about proactive defense and things, but there's a component here when you're identifying your incident response plan and how you're going to respond if there's a breach. You should also, organizations have throughout time, after they've identified the breach, they've gone and maybe launched a forensic investigation to what Ben was saying. But that needs to be identified in the forefront, in my opinion. You need to have essentially what I call forensic readiness, right? You need to know how you're going to respond and what are those avenues going to be. And so whether that's internal to your own organization doing it if you're sophisticated, or if you're going to outsource that to an organization, a cybersecurity firm to go and do that, you should have that already, that plan in place, because there is a ton of value that comes from a forensic investigation so that you can go back to, as I was explaining, readapting your security, because you don't want them coming back the next week with the same 2007 exploit and taking advantage of your network. You need to constantly be able to go through and modify it.
We're starting to run down on time, so I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up for you guys. If you guys don't have questions, trust me, I have a bevy of them waiting, so I find this fascinating. All right, messaging and escalation, I think that's key. I would love you guys to tell us what's worked, what hasn't worked. Is there a different message for a different audience? Do you consider clients versus legal and reputational risk? What is your best advice?
So let me jump in there, and I'm gonna answer this from an unexpected angle, Joanna.
Shocking.
Shocking. One of the common holes that I've seen a lot of customers fall into, thinking about messaging, and I'm just talking about messaging in the context of an incident. The four of us are all employees of the same company. We've got the incident response plan that I hoped you had. That's great. How do you communicate and message internally around that? Well, 95% plus of the incident response plans that I've seen rely on email. I'm going to contact my colleague John and Mike and Joanna using the same corporate email system, which is great. You know, we're comfortable with that. We've all got the right clients. Well, you know, we have this thought exercise with customers. Let's kind of play it out. If the bad guys are in your environment, is it potentially likely they might also have access to the very same email server, maybe even your credentials? So thinking about out-of-band communications, maybe a pre-assigned phone bridge, or maybe some other method that doesn't rely on corporate resources. A lot of companies don't take that extra step to think about it, but when you're in the midst of a compromise, you're not necessarily thinking about that. So that's my left field answer for you.
I knew I could count on you. John, any sage words?
Yeah, what we find is clients are so different, even in the same industry or government versus private versus publicly traded. They all have their own DNA and their own culture. So you have to tailor a response and a solution that matches their DNA and culture. And that's the constant challenge. There's no one, for us, there's no one cookie cutter fits all. So it's about creating solutions that fit the culture and DNA of the government entity, the corporate entity, the privately held entity.
Mike, anything that doesn't work, what's the worst thing you can do?
Worst thing you can do in terms of messaging. So what I would say is, back to the hair on fire kind of comments, the worst thing you could do is just act off of impulse, sending out kind of blatant messages. Or one recent customer or client went and actually ended up, and more technical solution here, they went and shut down their entire network at basically on the advice of their current security organization. And so in that environment, that causes more panic for the people that are working at your organization than it does to be able to go and actually prevent it, where they could have put very good technical solutions in place and been able to communicate that more effectively than just by shutting down the network for 2 days plus.
All righty, I'm happy to open it up for questions, or I can keep rambling. Your choice.
I think they're...
Hi, I have a comment more than a question. One is for the incident response plan. I didn't hear a mention of when to invoke law enforcement or when to reach out to law enforcement. So that's really important too in a response plan. The other thing is, one of the things we have talked about or alluded to is the regulations. And having been a security practitioner for over 20 years, I will say that I've changed fences, cross the fence, and think the regulation is actually very good for the for cybersecurity enforcement in companies. The reason being, besides everything that we've talked about, the biggest challenge that I see is that companies and management still don't see cybersecurity as a strategic risk. And the SEC guidance that has come out, the cybersecurity guidance, talks about, yes, you have to know what to do when you are breached, but also they want to see what have you done to prevent it, because this is not a black swan or a unforeseeable event. So I just wanted to just mention that I think in the past, regulation was considered the bad thing, but now it really is very important because it is forcing companies to go and businesses to think on the right path.
Great comment, and I'll just follow up on your first point where you mentioned law enforcement, involving them in the IR or incident response plan. Yes, please. One of the great statistics that Verizon puts out every year, they have a data breach investigations report, DBIR, that literally was just released for 2016 in the last week. And once again, one of the many good stats out of that is more times than not, more than 50% of the time, it's a third party that notifies you that there's a breach inside your network. And more times than not, it's law enforcement bringing you that information. So having a good relationship with law enforcement is important. The FBI has a fairly strong, fantastic public-private program called InfraGard, I-N-F-R-A-G-A-R-D, I-N-F-R-A-G-A-R-D. It does require a cursory background check. They typically work with American citizens only, but at least in my case, selfishly, living in the greater Washington, D.C. area, I have the name and the phone number of my local FBI agent who's in charge of all cyber for the area. And if and when I have an issue with my employer, I'm not going to have a problem calling her because I have a relationship. So law enforcement is important. If you have the time and the cycles to invest in that relationship ahead of time, I think you're only helping yourself.
And I would add on to that, even outside of law enforcement, I mean, you have Department of Homeland Security and other entities which are fantastic resources, and those organizations are really charged with trying to get the word out there, right? Whether that's through like a TLP bulletin or something like that. And so the more the community is able to share with the U.S. government or even with other cybersecurity firms, it can start to be able to be pushed into other entities to be able to come up with solutions to be able to start to protect those organizations.
And depending on which market you're in, there are various industry groups to communicate, and there are obviously different regulatory requirements if you're a registered or publicly traded entity that you need to communicate with, whether it's state or regulatory officials, and, as well as the FBI, et cetera. Any other questions? Oh, excellent.
Just a really simple question. Bothering me for a while. Obviously, financial companies are targeted. I'm aware of a couple of large household name financial institutions who had expensive hacks. I'm sure there are thousands of them. But in one particular case, a senior management person told me it was between $1 and $2 billion. Now that's enough money to show up. But I went and looked at the quarterly 10Q, and I went and looked at the balance sheet, and there's no trace. So maybe they wrote it off against reserves. It's a lot of reserves even for that company. Or is Homeland Security subsidizing companies in exchange for their collaboration on money laundering and such events? I mean, who's paying for, we talked about the metrics on cybercrime. It seems like the citizenry is paying for some of this, perhaps properly, but I'm interested in your views.
Well, I don't think any of us are government representatives, so I can't characterize if DHS is subsidizing. I would be surprised to learn that that was the case.
Yeah.
We're seeing a lot of activity in the cyber insurance space as one means for organizations to try and offload some of that risk and the potential cost to some other organization that's willing to assume it.
Right.
But that industry is still fairly new and growing at this time.
Agreed. I've never heard of the DHS picking up or somehow subsidizing the appropriate disposal of hardware and the information contained therein, even when it has to do with government assets.
Yes, sir.
So I know today we talked a lot about the different areas, and it's kind of hard to determine where you want to invest your money or where to focus on. In terms of what you see, I know we focus on response, but we also have prevention, which is a lot of people say invest in prevention. What is this? Obviously, you can't see an adversary once they breach a network, so you need those in terms of response. But from an investor standpoint, I've yet to find a company that does prevention, the detection, and the incident response all in one. So where would you recommend people look at investing their money in terms of cybersecurity? Because even though this is hard to determine, I break them down in those three areas: prevention, detection, and incident response.
So you might get different answers from us, but I think there are many vendors. There's at least one vendor who I'm not going to name who's sitting on this stage right now. He might even be talking right now.
I know he does incident response and detection.
Yeah, well, but there's at least one other vendor up here who can do all three, okay? Prevention, detection, and incident response. But I would encourage you, this is not necessarily something, yeah. You don't necessarily want to put all of those eggs in one basket, okay? There's a lot of useful rationale behind diversifying your supplier sources in the security space. I would say if you had an organization that was struggling to kind of figure out that question, there are many vendors, Mike's organization, my organization, and others who I'm sure would be happy to come in and just help you think about, given limited budget, right? Nobody has unlimited budget to fully fund all three of those areas you just described. Where should we start? If I had $1, I would focus very much on the detection/respond quadrant because you are going to be attacked, or you have been attacked in the past and you haven't quite figured it out yet. But there are vendors who would love to take all three of those pieces of the business together. The good news is I think there are a lot of very good consulting firms who can help you kind of find that right answer.
All right, we're going to have to wrap up, but Mike needs to respond since he's the vendor of choice.
Yeah, I guess to Ben's point, that was a great answer. To Ben's point, really, then on the investment side, so organizations, when I kind of laid out the cyber landscape, traditionally, it's been automate, right? Buy some capabilities, throw them in the network, and go from there. Really, the shift in cyber to have a secure environment to be able to protect your PII or to be able to go protect your elements needs to be in how do you quickly reduce that response time, right, as Ben was saying. So take your response from 200 days, allowing the adversary in there, and let's get it down to within weeks and minutes and hours, right, or what have you. And so really, you're going to start to see, and we had forecasted inside Route 9B many years ago when we stepped out of the military, you're going to start to see organizations moving more into the proactive defense component. But you have to start focusing on your people, right? And so products are fantastic. Automated solutions are pretty much a requirement nowadays because they act as really, instead of security products, they're really threat intelligence sensors is kind of the way I see them. And so the organizations that'll end up coming up and will be kind of like Route 9B, more focused in that proactive defense environment, looking for the adversary, and then ultimately having the abilities to take that action.
All right, I want to thank the panel. It's been a pleasure working with them. Thank you.
Thank you.